This is Rise. Let's lock in with the goal of changing one life at a time. Yours. Together, let us rise up, inspire, strengthen, and elevate our minds. It's time to Rise on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello, my name is Dr. Saran Heron, and welcome to Rise. Today, we're going to talk about schizophrenia and how it can affect individuals and family. My guest today is Deborah Kasdan. She holds a Bachelor and Masters in English from Washington University in St. Louis, currently a board member of NAMI, which is National Alliance on Mental Illness in Connecticut, and a member of ISPC, International Society for Psychological and Social Approaches to Psychosis. Deborah Kasdan had a 35-year career writing about business and technology before retiring and joining Westport Writers Workshop to make her personal stories about her sister come alive, who was diagnosed with schizophrenia. She is here to share her journey as it pertains to grief, shame, survivor's guilt, and share how she continues to honor her sister. Deborah Kasdan, welcome to Rise here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Thank you, Dr. Saran.
What inspired you to choose your career?
Well, when I went to college, it was the mid-1960s, and I wasn't actually too career-oriented. I had my children right after I graduated. And then I went back to school to get something more practical under my belt, and I actually got a certificate in special ed. But while I was looking for a job in that field, they were kind of scarce. I took a job editing a trade publication for the beer industry. And I learned so much about that industry. I felt like I had received an MBA. You know, I hardly knew anybody working in the private sector. My family and friends were all social workers, teachers, artists, academics. But I really enjoyed learning how the real world worked. And I found I could use my writing and analytics skills, which I learned in college to get ahead. So I went on to work for 3 more publishers before arriving at IBM, where I worked for 15 years.
Wonderful. Now, like you just mentioned, you spent 35 years in that industry. So share with us within that type of job, what are some interesting things that job entailed for you to do on a daily basis?
Well, I was writing and working on the application of computers in business right when that was getting started. And I just found that fascinating. So I learned to understand the products and services enough to explain it to clients, partners, the public, and make it compelling, show how it applies to them. So some of the things I did was provide support in the form of written materials, speeches for executives, direct mail, events, developing and implementing programs related to business development, and explain things to a wide variety of stakeholders, provide content for social media. So there was always something different. It was never the same. So that's what I enjoyed.
Excellent. Now, your sister, Rachel, was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Speak to us about the signs and symptoms, and how old was she then?
Yeah. After she graduated from my high school, she went to Israel for a year and worked on a farm, a kibbutz. And when she came back, she just seemed to be in great shape. She just glowed with energy, and she was all bronzed and muscular. So, but when she was a few years later, when she was like 23, she was institutionalized. The symptoms, irrational thinking. Once she got back from Israel, she just had ideas that didn't make a lot of sense. She didn't want to go to college, and she was very impulsive. Her behavior was disorganized. Some of the other symptoms are hearing voices. She didn't talk about that, but I think she may have been hearing voices, and some paranoid type thinking. She told me when she came back from a trip from San Francisco, because she was always darting around the country, that 2 men had followed her from New York City to California to San Francisco, and I could see the fear in her eyes, and it just didn't make sense. And then I knew why my parents were so concerned about her and wanted her to get help. Before I thought she was just being a, normal, rebellious adolescent. It's sometimes hard to distinguish normal behavior from, teenage behavior. Well, she was a little older than teenage. She seemed to be continuing to act like one. But sometimes it's hard to distinguish that behavior from, more psychotic symptoms.
Now, how challenging was that for your parents at that time to deal with?
Oh, it was hard. She was, much to my shock and dismay, stayed in the hospital, psychiatric hospital, for some time. But the deinstitutionalization movement was just starting. So that meant she was released to boarding houses. Now, this was in the early days of deinstitutionalization, and these places were pretty dangerous. They were in the inner city. She was assaulted, raped, and then when she was released, she would take off, and my father and take a bus to some distant city. My father had to go get her, and she was back in the hospital. So this was just a terrible pattern for my parents. And also, Rachel didn't even want to see her mother because she had some very deep-seated anger against my mother. So Mom would put together care packages for her, and Dad would bring them to her in the hospital. But this revolving door in and out and back into the hospital continued, and the hospital conditions were pretty poor. And my parents finally filed a suit in federal court to get conditions improved.
Wow.
It was a struggle.
I can imagine. Now, your sister did receive treatments. Could you share with us some of those treatments? I know you mentioned just now that she was institutionalized, and so she obviously was seeking help, and you were doing what you thought was best for her. But what are some treatments that, if you recall, any that she was given during that time?
Well, basically, it was just the psychotropic medications that were available then. And they were supposed to help with the schizophrenic symptoms, the voices, the delusions, but basically they just sedated her, and they had severe metabolic consequences. They caused a movement disorder that kind of like Parkinson's, that they call it tardive dyskinesia, and that's one of the side effects of those early medications. Then better medications came along, but they've all had side effects. So that was basically, for many, many years, the treatment that she received. Ultimately, she received treatment that helped her in the form of outpatient treatment with supportive housing and coaching, and we can talk about that later. But for years, it was nothing but this medication that had pretty bad side effects.
Now, for families who may have children that suffer from schizophrenia, from your experience, do you feel that there's still a stigma attached to that type of a problem?
Oh, definitely. Some mental illnesses are easier to talk about. Anxiety, even bipolar, which the symptoms overlap pretty much with schizophrenia, seems to have less of a stigma. For some reason, schizophrenia in the popular imagination is, very strange people, frightening, dangerous, and because it is so hard to treat, it's so challenging. They're just considered alien and untreatable. But even though it's hard to treat, recovery is possible, and they can be treated. But there are all these associations in popular culture that are very unpleasant and causes stigma.
You are listening to Rise on the Voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Dr. Saran Heron, and today we're talking to Deborah Kasdan. She holds a Bachelor and Masters in English from Washington University in St. Louis, currently a board member of NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness in Connecticut, and a member of ISPC, International Society of Psychological and Social Approaches to Psychosis. Deborah Kasdan had a 35-year career writing about business and technology before retiring and joining Westport Writers Workshop to make her personal stories about her sister come alive, who was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Now, we've been talking a little bit now, Deborah, and what are some advice that you would give to a family to ensure that they understand one's illness? Speak to us about that.
To understand it? Well, I think, as I said before, people should understand it is treatable and it's very fluid. I mean, there's no biomarker for schizophrenia. It's just a collection of symptoms that have been grouped in order to make treatment more efficient, coding. But basically, it's individual with every person. I mean, there's that thought disorder, and a lack of self-care, but it's also a lot of interpersonal issues, developmental issues. So it's very varied, individual by individual, but it is amenable to treatment. There are new approaches now that involve things beyond medication, more psychological and social approaches. So I think it's important to get away from the old stereotypes.
Now, I know you believe that generational differences played a role in your sister's illness. Explain that to us.
Well, when Rachel was born, it was during World War II. And so she and my mother lived with in-laws while my father was overseas in combat. When he came back, there was a whole lot of tension. And I think that tension had some type of effect on her developing neurological system that set a pattern. And maybe she had she probably has some genetic predisposition. Mm-hmm. And these early life events, I think, set a pattern whereby whatever predisposition she has it allows those issues to come out later in terms of development. So, my mother had her own issues, and I think that's what she was very needy. She had been abandoned by her father. So when my father came home, I think there was kind of a lot of conflict between the three of them. They had just been married. My mother needed attention. Baby Rachel needed attention. So, that set up some patterns that probably had an adverse effect on her.
Understandable. Now, what is your take on family therapy? And do you think that is beneficial to families, looking back now that you actually experienced that with your family?
Yeah, more than beneficial, I think is almost essential. When Rachel became ill, our family was kind of breaking up a little because myself and my brother were off to college already. So we weren't around. And so we didn't really have a good fix on what was happening. We didn't understand why our parents made decisions that they did. And I think there's so many, and that caused tension later on between the siblings and my parents. And I think that we could have pulled together a bit more, a bit earlier in this journey, had we all been involved in the decision making. I mean, or at least the older children. There's so much. It's so incomprehensible when this happens. When a sibling is so, is so affected, so disabled, and to us, to my brother and myself, it just seemed so unfair that she was in a locked ward. She was smart and bright and budding poet, and why should her life be just stopped like that? So there's just a lot of feelings, a lot of issues, and I think family therapy does a lot to help out. We did try it later on when we were trying to make some other decisions, but that was 15 years into it. I think it would have been helpful much earlier.
Agreed. Now, why do you carry a guilt, as you would call it, a survivor's guilt?
Why did I feel guilty?
Yeah.
Survivor's guilt. Yeah. Well, Rachel was in and out of hospitals and sometimes homeless, and sometimes I lost track of her because of various moves and various decisions. I was enjoying a wonderful family life of my own. So I had, wonderful husband, 2 beautiful children. I had jobs that I liked, challenging jobs, and a secure lifestyle, and all of that while she was suffering and homeless, and I couldn't help her. I didn't know how to help her, and I loved her, but what could I do? It was quite a dilemma. I just pushed it to the back of my mind for so long. I couldn't even think about it. People said, my parents said, don't worry about it, lead your life. But easier said than done. Can't help but feel it's not fair.
Absolutely. Now, for those who are listening to the program, what general recommendation could you offer, knowing, what your family did not know, as we call it?
I mean, if I had known then what I know now, I would say, to realize that, as I said before, recovery is possible, but you have to give it time. You can't expect, a treatment in the hospital, 6 weeks, 3 months, whatever, they're going to bounce back to normal, because a psychotic episode it takes a lot out of a person, and you have to give them time to recover. And so don't expect them to get back into college or get back into a job right away. And also it's important to get a realistic balance of self-care and care for your loved one, and to get help doing it. Don't try to do it alone. It's these are such difficult decisions to make. So you may need counseling or therapy for yourself to help understand what you can do and not feel guilty about what you can't do. And so it's important to reach out to people who can help. There are advocacy groups, and don't give into the shame and the stigma, and don't keep it a secret. Let friends and colleagues know what you're going through and dealing with if you're someone in your family is having a mental health crisis. And as a family, it's important not to be judgmental about each other's decisions, how much another person can help with the care or not, and keep the family ties. It's easy to get estranged when there's a disagreement, but I think the more families can keep in touch and keep talking about what's happening and be honest about what they can and can't do, the better the whole family system will be.
Good advice. Now, your sister had a caseworker that got her into a program. Bring us back to that moment. How did the caseworker, get involved and helped your family with that?
Yeah, it was like in the last decade of her life, she had ended up in the Pacific Northwest. This journey started in St. Louis when she was first hospitalized, but because of a decision to try to help, for my brother to try to help her himself out in Seattle, she ended up in the Northwest. That backfired, and she ended up pretty much alone and in the hospital systems in Oregon. And after being in and out of 3 hospitals there, she ended up on the back wards of one of them. But she applied for a work program sponsored by a local agency in Eugene, and a caseworker was assigned to oversee her trial participation there. So as part of the work program, she was a janitor. She was supposed to clean the agency reception area. And this caseworker went to check on her work, and he found a poem she had written on the desk. And it was called Water. And it was just, he was kind of stunned by it. And he wasn't a poet himself. He gave it to a colleague who was a published poet, and she thought it was great. They read it at a staff meeting. And because of this poem, they agreed to admit her into the program. He thought they were otherwise not inclined to it because she was pretty impaired at that point. But her poem had such spirit and such depth and such personality and such a cry for help that he got her into the program. He talked to the housing person. They were able to get her housing. They brought her her medication. And there were some ups and downs, but ultimately his support played a big part in her ability to live free, which is what I always wanted for her, not to be locked up. She loved nature. She ended up living in a place in the wooded area by the river, and she got to enjoy walks along the river and in the woods, and she could come and go as she pleased. And that was very satisfying to me.
You are listening to Rise on the Voice of Nassau Community College 90.3 WHPC. My name is Dr. Saran Heron, and today we're talking with my guest, Deborah Kasdan. She holds a Bachelor and a Master's in English from Washington University in St. Louis, currently a board member of NAMI in Connecticut and a member of ISPC, which is the International Society for Psychological and Social Approaches to Psychosis. Deborah Kasdan had a 35-year career writing about business and technology before retiring and joining Westport Writers Workshop to make her personal stories about her sister come alive, who was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Now, Deborah, you, in honor of your sister, you wrote Roll Back the World, which is the sister's memoir. Talk to us about the title and tell us a little bit about the book.
Well, Rachel loved poetry. She was writing poetry even before she got ill. Roll Back the World is a line from one of her poems about walking the beach at night. I like to think that she wrote it. It describes a beach along the Mediterranean from when she was in Israel. The poem is called In Delicate Aroma. I walk in the last verse where the line is from says, roll back the world, for so I have been free, with a crab in the sea and my shadow on the moonlit beach. I've included, half a dozen or so of her poems interspersed in the memoir. I've included excerpts from her letters. I was able to put together this book because I had so much source material in terms of letters. My parents saved everything their 4 children wrote to them. And when we moved my mom, I had access to that. And I really felt that when Rachel died, that I had this mission to write this book, to let her know that I loved her. I mean, after the fact, but I felt that I could do that I could express this love for her. And I felt that I could also solve some of the questions I'd always had about what happened to her. There were times when we were out of touch. I didn't know where she was. So I got hospital records. I went through them. So I was able to figure out where she was when and put that together with my own feelings about what happened and about what happened to our other siblings. There were 4 of us. So it kind of weaves together Rachel's story with my family's story, and includes her poetry and excerpts of her letters.
Wonderful. Now, I know you're partnering with NAMI in Connecticut. Could you tell me about some of the events that you recently have done with them?
Yeah. I'm a past board member. I'm not currently a board member, but they co-sponsored a local event. I did it at a local library, and that was very rewarding, where I was able to talk about my book, had a presentation, and they had a table passing out literature for people who attended who might have questions about how NAMI could help them. So that was really great. I plan to have a virtual book event with them to talk in their book club. So yeah, and they're a very important resource for people who first have mental illness in the family and don't know where to turn. They have programs for families, and they're free. There's no charge at all. So they're a very important resource.
Excellent. Now, for those listening on the program that would like to connect with you, how can they reach out to you?
I think if you go to my website, Deborah Kasdan, DeborahKasdan.com, you'll find more information and contact information.
Wonderful. Thank you for being here, Deborah Kasdan. It was a pleasure.
I enjoyed speaking with you, Dr. Saran.
Wonderful. I'm Dr. Saran Heron. It is important to understand one's illness, get information, as Deborah mentioned, seek help, and ensure proper support is obtained to cope. I thank you for listening to this week's edition of Rise, available wherever you listen to podcasts, and always right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.